Well, hey, this is Eddie McCain, and I'm doing my research on British prisoner of war ships during the Revolutionary War and how they treated American POWs. And right now I am on Sullivan's Island in Charleston Harbor, Charleston, South Carolina. And the reason why I'm here is one of my sources, a book called Patriots in Exile, Charleston Rebels in St. Augustine, which was written by James McGrady and C.L. Bragg, referenced at least 2 prison ships that were kept by the British here in this harbor. And I always believe when given the opportunity to get a visual that it'll help you to understand, exactly, what was transpiring and really get the significance of it. But the British had prison ships up and down the East Coast. They had them in New York Harbor, New York City Harbor, Charleston Harbor, which is right here, Savannah, Georgia Harbor, and St. Augustine Harbor in St. Augustine, Florida. And while most of their prisons were on ships that were parked normally a couple of miles out in the harbor, not all of them were. There were some prisons that were land. About 10 years after the war, a man named Grant Thorburn moved to New York City, and he moved right up the street from this big large building that everybody referred to as the Sugar House. The reason why it was called the Sugar House is because before the war, that building is where they processed sugar. But when the British occupied New York City, they turned it into a prison. And this man named Grant, who just lived a half a block away, he noticed just about every day there'd be old American war veterans from the Revolution, often bringing their families, come into that building, and they would stop, go up to the building, and they'd meditate and they'd pray. And after a while, he began to ask why they were doing that, and these former POWs shared their horror stories with him. And over a long period of time, he would interview these prisoners, and he would write down the horror stories that they told. The stories of being starved, of being in disease-infested ships, of being brutalized, and he put it all on paper. And then about 10 years ago, author Edmund Burroughs, an historian, came across these writings, and he wrote a book. He wrote a book called Forgotten Patriots. And in this book, he writes about the horror stories that these guys went through. And it's not a common fact, at least I didn't know this until I started doing this research, but there were more Americans who died as British prisoners of war in prisons ran by the British than were actually killed in combat fighting the British. That's how nasty and horrible they were. So you have to ask the question, why were we treated so brutally and so bad for it? Well, King George III and the British did not consider America as a government. They did not consider us as a legitimate military, and they did not consider our soldiers as legitimate soldiers. They considered us as traitors. And as you know what they do with traitors, traitors normally get executed. But the way that King George justified referring to us as traitors and for treating us the way that they did is back in 1543, the Imperial Act was established under King Henry VIII. This was in 1543. And the Imperial Act stated that any countries under the crown that were separate from England, that they had traitors, the traitors could be brought to England, tried, and then executed. And while I could find no sources stating that King George ever brought any American colonials to England and tried them, they definitely put us all in prisons during the war. And we were not treated as POWs, we were treated as traitors to the king and traitors to England. And just to orientate you where we are, I'm on Sullivan's Island, straight across the harbor. You're looking at Fort Sumter. And to the right, if you can see it in the distance, that's the beautiful city of Charleston, South Carolina. And right behind me is another piece of Revolutionary War history called Fort Moultrie. And that's where we initially prevented the British fleet from coming into Charleston Harbor. Of course, eventually they did, and the city was surrendered, which is how we got the prison ships put out here. But anyway, I hope you've learned a little bit about British prisons and how they treated POWs and why they treated our POWs that way. I know I have doing this research, and I hope you have a good day.